My name is Walter Monroe. I am 76 years old, and until recently I lived alone in the same red brick house in suburban Atlanta where my wife and I raised our son and spent nearly 50 years together. The neighborhood has changed over time. Old neighbors moved out, younger families moved in, trees grew taller, sidewalks cracked. But I stayed. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, and because I couldn't bring myself to leave the place where every wall still whispered her name. My wife, Margaret, passed away 4 years ago, quietly, in her sleep. I found her the next morning, her hand still resting on the edge of the bed as if she were about to reach for mine. The coroner told me it was peaceful. No pain, no struggle, just the heart, finally giving in. That's supposed to comfort you, isn't it? When someone says they didn't suffer. But it didn't. Not really, because she left. And I stayed. And the silence she left behind is anything but peaceful. I had a workshop in the garage where I used to repair broken toasters, leaky faucets, furniture legs, anything that gave me the illusion of control, the feeling that I could still fix something. I was a maintenance man for nearly 40 years at a local school district. I used to wake up at 5 every morning, drink the first cup of coffee Margaret handed me while still half asleep, kiss her cheek, and head to work in my green uniform. There wasn't a leak or a stuck locker I couldn't handle. Kids called me Mr. Walt teachers trusted me. I worked hard, took pride in being reliable. But retirement, despite its promise of rest, brought a strange kind of grief. The rhythm of my days collapsed. My wife tried to keep me busy, enrolling us in church activities, potlucks, weekend drives. She wanted us to stay part of the world. I suppose I didn't try hard enough. I liked the routine, but I didn't understand back then how much of it was her. When she died, it was like all the scaffolding of my life fell apart. Our son, Jason, lives not too far from me, maybe 15-20 minutes by car. He has a wife, Diane, and 2 daughters, Claire and Savannah. They're good girls, bright, always busy with something. I used to think I'd be a bigger part of their lives. Jason and I were never especially close. He took after Margaret. Quiet, cautious, deliberate. I respected that about him. But over the years, something in our relationship changed. Maybe it was slow, like rust creeping in along the joints of a once solid bridge. After Margaret passed, I thought Jason would step up, check on me more, maybe invite me over. And he did, in the beginning. But it faded fast. Birthday dinners became phone calls. Phone calls became texts. Texts stopped altogether unless I initiated them. I told myself he was busy. Mortgage, job, kids, life. Everyone's busy these days. The truth is, I tried to keep my independence. I didn't want to be a burden. I never wanted to be that old man everyone treads around, afraid he might fall or forget where he is. So I kept doing my grocery shopping on Tuesdays, picked up prescriptions at the same corner pharmacy where Margaret used to send me, and made myself simple meals. Toast, eggs, soup from a can. I managed. Or at least I told myself I did. Everything changed last fall when I slipped on wet leaves in my driveway and broke my hip. The pain was like a knife driving straight into my leg, and for the first time in my life, I screamed. I remember lying on the cold concrete, leaves stuck to my coat, thinking, not about dying, but about how long it would take for someone to find me. The neighbors weren't home. No one heard me. I stayed there almost an hour before the mail carrier noticed me and called an ambulance. Surgery, rehabilitation, the whole humiliating procession followed. I was discharged after a month with a walker and a stern warning not to live alone for a while. "You need support," the doctor said. "Someone who can help with meals, movement, check on you." I didn't want to go to a nursing facility. Jason offered something that, at the time, sounded like salvation. "Dad," he said, "come stay with us a while. Just rest in the back room. Diane and I will help you get back on your feet." He was so convincing, so warm. I remember the way Diane nodded beside him on the hospital bed, holding one of those oversized thermoses she always carried. "We'd feel better knowing you're safe," she said. "Claire's away at college now, and Savannah's always in her room anyway. You'll have your own space, your own bathroom, no pressure, just rest." They helped me pack some essentials, clothes, medications, Margaret's photo I kept on my nightstand. I left my house reluctantly, but reassured myself that it was temporary. A couple weeks, maybe a month. Then I'd be walking again, cooking my own eggs, drinking my morning coffee in peace, alone, as I always did. Jason drove me to their home, a large colonial with white siding and perfectly trimmed hedges. Everything was spotless, like out of a brochure. He parked in the driveway and opened the passenger door for me. Diane was already at the front step, waving. She helped me out slowly, took my walker, guided me inside. The house smelled of scented candles, lavender and something citrusy. Their dog, Baxter, barked once but didn't approach. "This way," Jason said, leading me down the hallway past the kitchen and dining room to a small room at the back of the house. It had a twin bed, a narrow dresser, and a single window with blinds pulled halfway down. "It's not much, but it's yours," he said. I thanked them both. I was grateful. Truly. They carried in my things, helped me settle. That night, Diane made lasagna. Jason helped me to the dining table, and we ate together like a real family. I smiled, thinking, maybe this won't be so bad. I didn't know then how quickly warmth could curdle. I didn't know that the room they offered me so kindly would become more like a holding cell. I didn't know how fast a son's kindness could turn into something colder, quieter, more calculated. I didn't know I had just handed over my autonomy to people who no longer saw me as a man, but as something else. A liability, an inconvenience, maybe even an opportunity. I didn't know any of it then. I thought I was healing. I thought I was safe. I thought I was home. But I was wrong, and I would soon discover just how wrong I was. The first few days at Jason's house were filled with the kind of cautious optimism that clings to the early stages of any change. Diane made breakfast. Soft scrambled eggs, toast without butter, tea instead of coffee. She insisted on helping me dress, though I could manage it myself, albeit slowly. Jason set up a television in the corner of the back room, tuned to the local news by default, and left the remote on the nightstand beside Margaret's framed photo. At night, he brought me a small bell and said, "Ring this if you need anything." The gesture struck me as tender, even a little old-fashioned, and for a brief moment I felt taken care of. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't want to trouble them. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself that this was family. They said the back room was the best place for me. Quiet, away from the bustle of the kitchen, with fewer stairs and close access to the bathroom. It made sense. Still, I noticed the door didn't quite close all the way, and the one small window offered a view not of the backyard, but of the side fence and the neighbors' garbage bins. The bed, narrow and creaky, sagged slightly in the middle, and I missed the firmness of my old mattress at home. But I said nothing. I didn't want to sound ungrateful. I reminded myself that Jason and Diane were doing me a favor, opening their home during what they believed to be a vulnerable moment in my life. I told myself to be patient. That healing, both physical and emotional, took time. Each morning I would wake before anyone else, a habit I'd kept since my working days. I'd sit upright, stretch my arms, and listen to the silence of the house. I expected to hear the clatter of pans, Diane humming in the kitchen, Jason moving around upstairs. But the silence lingered, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the hallway and the occasional bark from Baxter outside. One morning, I tried to make my own breakfast, shuffling slowly down the hall with my walker. I found the kitchen empty, the lights off. The pantry door was ajar, but most of the shelves were bare, at least of the things I could eat. No oatmeal, no bananas, just protein shakes, boxed cereals, and almond milk. I managed to toast a slice of bread and make myself a cup of instant coffee from a jar in the corner cabinet. As I sat down at the breakfast table, Diane came down the stairs. Her expression flickered, something between surprise and disapproval. "Dad, you should have waited," she said, her tone clipped, but not overtly rude. "I was going to bring your breakfast to you." "I didn't want to trouble anyone," I replied, lifting my mug in what I hoped was a disarming gesture. "Old habits die hard." She nodded, tight-lipped, and said nothing more. From that morning on, the kitchen was always locked when I woke up, a quiet but clear message that breakfast would be served on their terms, not mine. The days began to blur into one another. Jason worked long hours at the insurance firm, sometimes from home, but mostly at the office. Diane was often out, errands, meetings, yoga classes. Savannah, their younger daughter, kept mostly to her room, earbuds permanently in place, her eyes glued to the glowing screen of a laptop. I saw her only in passing. She never spoke more than a few words, and I could hardly blame her. What could a 17-year-old say to a man who moved slowly, took pills 3 times a day, and asked questions about books no one read anymore? I didn't blame her. I blamed myself for not being someone worth her time. Most of my time was spent in the back room. They had placed a tray table beside the bed, on which sat a rotating selection of meals: soups, microwaved vegetables, the occasional overcooked chicken breast. Diane left the meals silently, with no small talk or checking in. Sometimes she forgot entirely, and I would go to bed with the metallic taste of multivitamins and tap water instead of dinner. I didn't complain. I didn't want to be sent away. I'd heard too many stories about old men in state facilities who never saw a familiar face again. I reminded myself that this was family, even if it no longer felt like it. One afternoon, Jason came into the room holding a sheaf of papers. He stood by the door, didn't sit. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking. It might be helpful to organize some of your accounts, just in case anything happens. We could put me as a co-signer on your main checking, maybe consolidate the smaller accounts. You'd still have access, of course. It's just easier this way." I looked up at him, surprised. There was a strange tightness in his voice, a practiced lightness I didn't trust. "I appreciate the thought," I said, "but I'm still managing things myself. I might move slowly, but my head works just fine." He smiled, a rehearsed, placating thing, and said, Of course. Just offering, he left the room with the papers still in hand. That night, I stayed awake long after the house had gone quiet. I stared at the ceiling and remembered how Margaret once told me, during an argument about wills and planning, "The minute people think you can't manage your own affairs, they stop seeing you as a person." I hadn't understood her then. Now, lying alone in that back room, I understood perfectly. The next morning, I discovered that my wallet was missing. I kept it in the top drawer of the dresser, under my clean socks. I checked the drawer 3 times, pulled out every pair of socks, opened every pocket of the clothes I hadn't worn since arriving. Nothing. I hobbled slowly into the hallway and called for Diane. She appeared at the top of the stairs, frowning. "My wallet's gone," I said. "It was in the dresser." "Maybe you misplaced it," she replied, not moving. "You know how it is." "Things get shuffled around. I don't shuffle," I said. "I haven't been anywhere but this room." She descended the stairs slowly and disappeared into the room. I followed, leaned on the door frame, and watched as she pulled open the drawer and tossed the socks around carelessly. "Not here," she said after a moment. "We'll keep an eye out." Maybe Savannah borrowed it for school. I'll ask her. I wanted to say that Savannah wouldn't do such a thing, that she barely even acknowledged my existence. But I bit my tongue. The wallet never turned up. 2 days later, my cell phone, which I kept plugged into the outlet by the bed, refused to turn on. Jason said it must have shorted. He offered to take it to a repair shop. "We'll get you a new one," he said. "One with bigger buttons." That was the last I saw of the phone. I began to realize I was being cut off, slowly, quietly, efficiently. No wallet, no phone, no access to the kitchen. Meals were dictated. Medication schedules were recited like commands. When I asked for the television remote one evening, Diane handed it to me with a sigh, like a nurse dealing with a cranky patient. Jason, when he came home, seemed distant, preoccupied. And when he did speak to me, it was always in that same patient tone. "How are we feeling today? Did we sleep okay?" We, as if I were a toddler or a collective project. Not a father, not a man. One night, around midnight, I rose to use the bathroom and passed the cracked door of the upstairs study. Jason and Diane were inside, voices low. I heard Diane say, "He won't even notice. He's barely lucid half the time." Jason replied, "I don't know. He's slower, but he's not stupid." Diane said something I couldn't hear, and then Jason, "We'll wait another week. Then we'll talk to the bank." I froze. My hand clutched the walker tight. I stood there in the dark hallway, the carpeted floor cold against my feet, heart pounding. And in that moment, I understood what Margaret had tried to warn me about. They weren't helping me. They were preparing something I wasn't meant to recover from, something that began the day I entered that back room. The next week unfolded with a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of the house, as though an invisible curtain had been drawn between me and the rest of the family. There was no single event to point to, no shouting match, no confrontation, but the tone of everything changed. Breakfast, once delivered with a mild smile, now came late or not at all. Diane stopped knocking before entering the back room. She'd simply push open the door and announce, "Time for your pills," while placing the small plastic cup on the tray table and walking out without waiting for a word in return. Jason, when he was home, barely spoke to me. He passed through the hallway with a distracted nod, muttering something about conference calls or deadlines. Savannah disappeared entirely. Whether she was avoiding me or simply too busy with her life, I didn't know. I no longer asked. The room began to feel smaller, as if the walls were pressing in, stealing not just space, but dignity. I hadn't left the property in over 2 weeks. My only view of the world came through that narrow window, where I watched the neighbors' trash bins come and go, the same squirrels chase each other across the fence, the occasional Amazon truck idle and hiss. I asked Jason once, casually, politely, if I might get out for some fresh air. He paused, standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "It's not a good idea, Dad," he said. "You're still healing, and the stairs out back aren't safe. We don't want another fall, do we?" "I could use the front door," I offered. He shook his head. "Diane's been reorganizing the entryway. Too many boxes. Just take it easy, okay? The weather's going to turn soon, anyway." I nodded, but I felt something inside me begin to fracture, a small hairline crack running through the old foundation of trust I had tried to preserve. That night, I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the quiet murmur of the television in the living room, the clink of glasses, the sounds of laughter that never reached my doorway. I felt like a guest who had long overstayed his welcome, except I had no departure date, no destination, and no key to leave on the counter. A few days later, While Jason and Diane were out, I decided to venture further into the house. I didn't plan it. I just wanted to stretch my legs, feel less like a ghost. I moved slowly with the walker, inch by inch through the hallway. The living room was empty, but something about it felt off, like a stage hastily reset. Several picture frames that once lined the mantel were missing. A large cardboard box sat beneath the window, flaps half closed. I leaned over carefully and peered inside. It was filled with old tools, my tools, the same ones Margaret had given me for birthdays and anniversaries, the same battered toolbox I'd used for decades. The sight of it startled me. I hadn't brought those with me. They had been in the garage of my house. I backed away slowly and moved into the dining room. Another box sat near the corner, this one partially open. Inside, I saw my old radio, a pair of cufflinks I hadn't worn since Margaret's funeral, and a broken watch I'd kept for sentimental reasons. Each item registered as a shock, a new fracture along that same emotional fault line. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the box, until I heard a car pull into the driveway. Panic gripped me. I returned to the back room as fast as my legs would allow and sat down on the edge of the bed, heart racing. Jason's voice called out, keys jingled, and footsteps approached. He didn't come into the room. He didn't need to. I knew what I saw. The next morning, I waited until Diane had left to run errands. Jason was in the upstairs study. I tiptoed, yes, even with the walker, back to the living room. The box with my tools was gone. I opened the coat closet. Empty. I moved to the garage door, twisted the knob. It was locked. I checked the front door. Dead-bolted. The house was becoming a fortress, and I was not the owner of the keys. 2 days later, I overheard another conversation. Jason was on the phone, speaking in low tones. I stood just outside the back room door, barely breathing. Yeah, I've got the papers. We'll say it's for power of attorney, temporary, just medical stuff. He won't ask. He's too tired to care. A pause. No, I haven't told Diane. She's nervous. Thinks he suspects something. I stepped back into the room, heart pounding. A plan was unfolding behind closed doors, and I was the central piece. I had underestimated how far this would go. It wasn't just about keeping me quiet or out of the way. They wanted access to my accounts, my property, my life. And they were setting the stage, quietly rearranging the truth like boxes in the living room. Later that afternoon, Jason came into the room holding a manila envelope. "Hey, Dad," he said, too casually. "Got some forms from the doctor." Just routine stuff. Follow-ups, rehab check-ins, that kind of thing. Mind giving them a quick signature? He held out the pen, and I looked at him. Really looked. His face was familiar, but distant, like a photograph of someone you used to know before the light changed in their eyes. I took the envelope, opened it, and scanned the top page. Power of attorney, medical and financial. Durable, immediate. I thought this was from the doctor, I said evenly. Jason hesitated, then smiled. Yeah, it's just standard language. Doesn't mean anything's wrong. Just gives us flexibility in case you can't make it to appointments or if something happens. It's better to be prepared. And you'd be the one in charge? I asked, holding the page up. Just temporarily, he said, a little too quickly. You'd still have control. It's just for convenience, I stared at the paper. I could sign it and make things easier. For him, I could refuse and start a fight I wasn't sure I had the strength to finish. I set the paper on the tray table and placed the pen beside it. I'll read it over later, I said. Maybe tomorrow? Jason's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sure, no rush. He left the room, and I picked up the paper again, studying the fine print. Durable, immediate, no expiration, all authority transferred. I placed the papers in the drawer and stared at them for a long time, as if I could will them into harmlessness. That night, Diane brought dinner, something beige and lukewarm, and stood by the door while I took the first bite. "Jason said you had some questions about the paperwork," she said, voice neutral. I did. "It's just for your protection." "We want to help." I nodded slowly, swallowing. "Of course." She lingered another moment, then turned and left. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat up in bed, listening to the silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling around me, like a body preparing to rest. I imagined what would happen if I signed those papers, how quickly the rest of my accounts would vanish, how soon my house, my only real asset, might become theirs. I had no evidence, only instinct, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. In the morning, I asked Jason if he could take me back to my house, just to check on a few things. He stiffened. "It's really not safe yet," he said. "Your hip isn't ready." "I just want to look around," I said. "Not move back in. 15 minutes. "I'll think about it," he said, and then he left for the day. He never brought it up again. Days passed, and then a week. I asked again. He said the locks needed changing, that the plumbing had backed up, that it wasn't a good time. Eventually I stopped asking. But I started planning, because something in me, something stubborn, something that had built furniture and raised a child and held a marriage together for 50 years, knew that the moment I stopped trying, I would stop existing. They had moved the line once, turning my room into a cell. Now they were preparing to cross the next one. And I would not let them. Not quietly. Not with a signature. Not ever. It was a Thursday morning when I overheard a conversation that made everything fall into place, like the final click of a lock you didn't even know was closing. I hadn't slept well the night before, and I had gotten up earlier than usual, moving slowly from the bed to the door and cracking it just an inch. Jason and Diane were in the kitchen, their voices low but not low enough. They were talking about the pawn shop. Not in vague terms, specifics. Diane mentioned the address. Jason said something about the last box, and don't forget the ring. I felt my stomach lurch. The ring, Margaret's wedding ring, which I had kept in the small wooden box in my dresser back home. Not here. I had checked for it weeks ago and told myself it must have been misplaced. But now I understood. They had gone into my house. They had taken my things. They weren't waiting for my approval. They weren't even pretending anymore. After they left, I waited an hour, feigning sleep when Diane peeked in, then slowly dressed myself. I pulled on slacks and a wool cardigan, tied my shoes with shaking hands, and counted the cash I had managed to hide in a tissue box beneath the bed, a habit I had started back when Margaret was still alive. More out of principle than paranoia. It was just under $400. I took it and quietly made my way down the hallway, through the kitchen, and to the garage. The door was unlocked for once, and their second car, the older Honda, sat there with keys still hanging from the hook. I hesitated for only a second before taking them and stepping outside into the bright morning air. I hadn't driven since the accident, and my hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. But the roads were familiar, muscle memory guiding me more than anything else. I drove slowly, carefully, following the street signs until I reached the small pawn shop, nestled between a laundromat and a tattoo parlor. It was the kind of place you pass without noticing, the kind you don't enter unless you're desperate or reckless. The bell above the door rang softly as I stepped inside. The shop smelled of old electronics, worn fabric, and desperation. A young man in a beanie looked up from behind the glass counter. "Help you with something?" he asked, distracted, barely lifting his eyes. "I'm looking for some items." I said. A set of woodworking tools, a woman's gold wedding ring, an old radio, possibly pawned in the last 2 weeks by a man named Jason Monroe. He blinked, then straightened up slightly. You family. I'm his father, I said. And those items were stolen from me. He looked uncertain for a moment, then walked to the back room without a word. When he returned, he was holding a shallow tray. In it was my hammer, my old tape measure with the worn leather strap, Margaret's ring, still in its velvet box, and, God help me, the small photo of us from our 25th anniversary dinner, framed in silver and scuffed at the corners. I felt something in my throat twist painfully. I thought maybe it was a mistake, the man said quietly. I mean, he didn't look like he needed the cash. Nice clothes, newer car. Said he was clearing out his father's place after he moved into a facility. I looked at him, the words barely forming. How much did he get for these? $350 total, the man said, shrugging. He didn't haggle. Just wanted it done. I pulled out the cash I had brought and handed it over without hesitation. I want them back. Every piece. He nodded, took the money, and began wrapping the items in newspaper. You want a bag? I shook my head. No, I'll carry them. I walked back to the car, my arms full of the past, heart heavy with a grief that didn't come from death, but from betrayal so complete it scraped the bottom of something I didn't know I still had inside me. I sat in the driver's seat and stared ahead for a long time, watching the sunlight shift on the dashboard, feeling the slow tide of rage, grief, and resolve swell within me. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were clearing the space, preparing the narrative. Jason had spoken about me as if I were already gone. A man to be remembered, not included. When I got back to their house, I didn't go inside. I parked down the street and sat in the car for over an hour, thinking. My phone had been gone for weeks, but the car's radio still worked. I tuned it to the oldies station and let the music fill the space around me like armor. Then I drove. Not home, not yet, but to the public library, where I could use one of the computers without needing to explain myself. I spent 2 hours online, looking up my accounts, checking balances, searching legal terms, power of attorney, involuntary commitment, guardianship petitions. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew now that it was bigger than just a few boxes in a pawn shop. They wanted control, they wanted legal leverage, and they wanted it before I realized what was happening. I printed out statements, pulled up the contact for my bank, and found the name of the lawyer Margaret and I had used decades ago to draft our will. He was retired now, but his firm still existed. I made an appointment for the following day. When I returned to the house, I used the side door. Diane was in the kitchen. She looked up, startled. Where were you? Out, I said flatly. You should have told us. We were worried. I raised an eyebrow. Worried enough to pawn my wedding ring? Her face paled. I don't know what you're talking about. I held up the box. Then you won't mind me asking Jason, will you? She stared at me, silent, then turned away. That night, Jason didn't speak to me. He came in late, avoided eye contact, didn't mention the papers he had tried to get me to sign. But I noticed he had moved the envelope from the drawer. It was no longer in my room. I didn't care. I had seen what I needed to see. They had written the story already. The aging father, confused, losing memory, living quietly in the back room while the adult children sorted out the mess. A simple, sanitized ending. But they forgot something. I wasn't gone yet. I hadn't surrendered, and I would not let them decide how my story ended. The day after the pawn shop, I woke with the raw steadiness that follows a night of very little sleep and too many thoughts, the kind of steadiness that is more like a brace than a cure, and I dressed slower than usual because every movement made my hip complain, And because I had decided there would be no bell ringing that morning, no waiting for footsteps in the hall, no accepting a tray that arrived when it pleased someone else, and as I tightened the laces with numb fingers, I could already hear their voices in the kitchen, Jason's clipped and managerial, Diane's bright with the brittle cheer people use when they're worried someone might overhear the truth leaking out from between rehearsed lines. I stepped into the doorway and waited, and when Diane came with the pills, I told her I had an appointment at the library to print insurance forms, a harmless lie wrapped in words she understood. And she nodded too quickly, said she'd drive me after. She finished a call, then forgot me for an hour while I sat still and counted the ways a person can be erased without a single raised voice, and when she finally returned with her purse and a fixed smile, I let her take the handles of the walker and guide me out, not to the library as it turned out, but to a clinic I had never heard of, a beige building with a name that sounded like a developer's dream of compassion. She said it was just a quick assessment for my physical therapy plan, a routine screening, nothing invasive, she said, and she kept saying it while she signed something at the front desk, and while a nurse with a laminated badge led me down a corridor that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, and only when we sat in a small room with a plastic plant on the windowsill did the forms appear. Thick, official, already filled in except for my signature. Not therapy at all, but cognitive screening, and a release allowing Jason to receive results directly. And I looked at the line for my signature, and then at Diane, who couldn't quite meet my eyes. And I said I wasn't refusing care, but I would not sign anything today, and if they were concerned about my cognition, they were welcome to speak to my primary doctor, whose name they already had, if this were as routine as they claimed. The nurse smiled the way people do when they've been warned a difficult relative might cause trouble, said we could reschedule, and printed me a copy of the unsigned forms when I asked for them. And on the drive home, Diane kept the radio too loud and her answers too short, and at one point she said, almost gently, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that families do better when everyone lets the most practical person steer. And I thought of Margaret's hands on the steerings, wheel during Sunday drives, how she would rest her wrist at 12 o'clock and hum, how we got where we were going without a map because we looked up and decided together. That evening Jason arrived early, and I heard the front door close with the careful emphasis of a man arranging a scene, and he stood in the doorway of the back room with a folder under his arm, and asked if I had enjoyed my little test, as if I were a boy returned from an errand with a lollipop in my pocket, and when I didn't answer he walked in and placed a stack of mail on the tray table, and told me, with practiced sympathy, that he had gone by my house to collect it because the box had been overflowing, and the top envelope was addressed to me in a familiar hand I could not place until I opened it and found a glossy postcard with a photo of my living room and the words, "Estate Liquidation," this Saturday in cheerful block letters, and, beneath the photograph, smaller text promised fair prices for tools, radios, furniture, and collectibles, and at the very bottom, where the ink bled slightly, was my address. I asked Jason when we had decided to liquidate the contents of my home, and he said calmly that the flyer was a mistake left by a company Diane had merely consulted, and when I held up the postcard and pointed to the photo, my mantle, my chair, the lamp with Margaret's crooked shade, his mouth tightened, and he said I was overreacting and that nothing would happen without my consent. But his eyes slid toward the hall, and I knew there was already a lockbox on my front door and a schedule on someone's clipboard. I set the postcard down and told him I'd be going by the house tomorrow to check the windows and the shed, and he said that wouldn't be necessary because a contractor had found soft rot under the kitchen sink and the place wasn't safe. And I asked for the contractor's name, and he said he didn't have it handy, and I said I would wait, and we let the silence do the arithmetic that words refused to show. The next morning I didn't wait for a ride, because waiting had turned into a kind of permission I was no longer willing to grant, and I called a cab from the landline in the den while Diane watered a plant on the porch, and I stood in the doorway, pretending to enjoy the sun until the car pulled up, and the driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a scar at his brow, helped me with the walker. And when we turned onto my street, I saw the sign before I saw the house, a discreet white rectangle staked into my lawn with a realty logo and a smiling agent's name, and a silver lock box hanging from the knob as if my front door had been arrested. I asked the driver to wait while I made a slow circuit of the yard, and by the garage I found a length of blue painter's tape still stuck to the siding where someone had measured for shelving, and through the workshop window I could see gaps on the pegboard like missing teeth where my chisels and planes had hung, and when I tried the back gate, it opened to reveal a trio of folding tables stacked with boxes labelled in permanent marker, books, kitchen, linens, and on one box, written in a smaller, familiar hand, the words D.A.D.'s Photos, which I lifted with both arms against my chest and carried to the cab like contraband. The driver watched me carefully and said nothing until I was belted in, and then he asked softly if I wanted to go to the police, and I said not yet, because I had learned that sometimes you go to the bank first, sometimes you go to a lawyer, and sometimes you stand very still and let the people who want something take one more step, just one, into the light. At the bank, I asked to speak to a manager and said I would wait as long as necessary. And when a woman in a navy blazer invited me into her office, I set the postcard and the unsigned clinic forms and my driver's license on her desk, and I told her, in a voice that shook only once, that my card had gone missing, that my mail was being intercepted, that there might be attempts to add names to my accounts or to request balances by phone, and she tipped her head and asked if I wanted to place a verbal password and restrict all third-party access, and I said yes. And she asked if there had been unusual activity, and when she pulled up the screen she frowned and turned it slightly so I could see the recent attempts at a large transfer that had failed for want of proper authorization, and she pointed out a smaller withdrawal at an ATM across town on a night I had been in bed in the back room, and I signed the forms to freeze the card and requested a new one to be held for in-branch pickup. And then, because I had practiced the words in the cab, I asked to open a new account at a different branch and to move a portion of the money there, and she nodded without surprise and asked if there was anything else she could do for me today, and I said yes. Please print a letter stating that I had appeared in person, alert and oriented, to make these changes of my own free will. And she did, and I folded that letter and tucked it into the box of photos where Margaret's smile would keep it, safe. From the bank I limped next door to a phone store and bought the cheapest handset they had that would still make calls and take pictures, paid in cash, and asked the kid behind the counter to show me, slowly, how to record voice memos, how to email a photo, how to back up a file to something that wasn't a drawer someone else could open. And he did, patient as a good teacher. And when I stepped outside, I called the law firm whose name I'd found at the library and made an appointment for the following afternoon, and then I called the pawn shop and asked the young man if he would be willing to print me a copy of the receipt with Jason's name on it, and he said he wasn't supposed to, but he had a father too, and he would see what he could do. I sat on a bench and looked through the box of photos, and I found one of Jason at 12 holding the bluegill he caught at the lake, grinning as if nothing in the world had ever been as simple as that fish, and I let myself feel the ache of it, without letting that ache change my mind. When I returned to the house that evening, the air had the tinny taste of a storm not yet arrived, and Jason was waiting at the kitchen table with a man I didn't know, mid-30s, neat beard, expensive watch, a legal pad in front of him, and a pen. He clicked once as if to signal that we were now beginning, and he introduced himself as a family services consultant who helped coordinate care plans and paperwork for seniors navigating transitions. And he said the word transition as if it were a soft couch you fall into when you're tired, and he asked if we could all agree that safety was our shared priority, and I said safety was a fine word when it wasn't used as a mask for ownership. And he blinked politely and kept his smile in place, and Jason said this was getting out of hand, that I had left the house without telling anyone and had upset Diane, and that this wasn't sustainable, and the consultant slid a new set of documents toward me. Not power of attorney this time, but a voluntary admission form to a short-term memory care residence, where, he assured me, I would have more freedom, more socialization, more everything, and I said I would not be signing anything tonight. And the consultant nodded, as if I had chosen an item from a menu, and said that in that case they could schedule an evaluation by a clinician who could determine capacity. And there it was, set on the table between the salt shaker and the pen, the word they had been circling since the first bell: capacity, the key that would open every drawer they wanted. I asked for a copy of everything he had brought, and he obliged, and as he packed his bag, he said he admired families who stepped up, and Jason walked him to the door with the fixed jaw of a man who believes he has done the responsible thing and been misunderstood by the one person whose understanding he requires. That night they locked the kitchen again, not with a visible latch, but with the quiet choreography of moving things out of reach, and my tray arrived late and light, and the remote had been replaced by one with fewer buttons that did not seem to change the channel no matter how I pressed, and sometime after midnight I heard voices in the hall, and then the murmur of a stranger at the threshold who identified himself as Officer Miller here for a wellness check, and he shone a small flashlight toward the ceiling rather than my face, and asked if I knew where I was, and who the president was, and what day it might be. And I answered each question with a patience I did not feel, and asked if he would like to see the letter from the bank manager, stating that I had appeared in person that very day to conduct my own affairs. And he read it, and nodded, and thanked me, and said, almost apologetically, that they had to respond when family called, and I said I understood, and asked if he had children, and he said 2 boys, and that they were still small, and that he hoped he would do better when they were grown, and I told him I hoped so too, for all our sakes, and he wished me a good night, and left the door a little wider than he'd found it. In the morning the sky finally broke, and rain came hard enough to blur the fence outside my small window, and while the storm muscled the gutters, I listened to the house move around me, and I made a list in my head of what I had, what I needed, and what I was willing to leave behind, and on that list I put my marriage photo, my driver's license, the bank letter, the unsigned forms, the postcard, the new phone with its small, stubborn memory, and the box labeled DAD's photos, which felt heavier than its contents warranted because it now held proof as well as pictures, and I waited for the sound of the garage door and the quiet house that follows people who believe they have you surrounded, and when it came, I set the phone to record, and I called out for Diane, and when she appeared I asked, without raising my voice, whether she had called the police the previous night, and whether she intended to do so again, and she said she had been scared, and that I seemed confused, and that she didn't know what else to do, and I told her fear was not a license to invent facts, and she flinched and said, Jason would handle it, and I said I knew he would, which was why I had an appointment tomorrow with someone who would handle it for me, and she stared at me as if I'd spoken a language she had forgotten she once knew. In the late afternoon, when the rain thinned to a veil, there was a knock at the back door, and the young man from the pawn shop stood there with a folder under his jacket, hair wet, cheeks pink from the weather, and he handed me a copy of the receipt. With Jason's signature and the inventory list and a short note, he had typed himself stating that the items appeared to be personal belongings, not commercial goods, and that the seller had represented himself as authorized to liquidate an elder relative's property, and he said he hoped it helped, and that he didn't want any trouble, and I told him he had already done more than he knew, and I slipped the papers into the box, and felt a steadiness I had not felt since the fall in the driveway, a steadiness not of bone, but of intention, and I understood that this was not the end of anything yet, only the moment before you lift your foot and place it where you mean to stand. Jason came home early again, and there was a new edge to his courtesy, a shadow of hurry in the way he asked how I was feeling, and when I answered that, I felt clear he said, "Good," the way a man says, "fine," when he has lost the argument but intends to win the war, and he asked if I would be willing to meet a notary tomorrow to tie up loose ends, and I said I would meet my lawyer instead, and he stared at me as if the word had surprised him with its accuracy, and he said, almost gently, that none of this was necessary if I would simply trust him, and I said I trusted him to act according to his interests, and for a moment we looked like two men in a mirror, father and son, each holding a belief forged over years the other could not accept, and then he turned away, and somewhere in the house a printer started up, and I knew the next paper would not be one I was invited to sign. That night the wind rattled the gutters again, and the power flickered, and I lay awake and listened to the rain hammer the lockbox on my own front door across town, and I counted the seconds between thunder and the crack that follows until the numbers settled my breath, and I thought of Margaret's voice when she would say, in the kindest tone she had, that people reveal themselves most clearly when they are certain you are unable to answer back, and I understood that the second act of this quiet war had begun not with a shout but with a clipboard, a form, a lock, and a smile, and that before I could reach the part where I choose, I would have to endure one more day of being chosen for, and I promised myself that tomorrow, when the sky cleared, I would not be in this back room when they came to ask for my consent to what had already been done. The day of reckoning came quietly, without any dramatic announcement, no raised voices or slammed doors, but with a sequence of small choices and deliberate movements that made it clear that I was no longer simply enduring what was happening to me. I was responding. I woke earlier than usual, while the house was still, and I sat for a long while at the narrow window of the back room, looking at the grey light of morning, rehearsing in my head the conversation I knew was inevitable. Jason had been circling me for weeks, pressing with forms, with insinuations, with fabricated narratives of confusion, and Diane had perfected her role as the weary caretaker burdened with an old man's decline. But I was not declining, not in the way they wanted, and that morning I decided to show them that clearly. When Jason finally entered, folder under his arm, voice practiced into something soft and firm at once, I let him sit across from me. He began his script again about safety, about the inevitability of transitions, about how signing over power of attorney would only be temporary, a safeguard. I did not argue. I asked him to repeat himself. I asked him to explain what exactly temporary meant. I asked him to define capacity each time he stumbled slightly, though he covered it with a smile, and I sat back, letting him grow more impatient. When he finally pushed the papers across the tray table, I did something he did not expect. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the letter from the bank manager, the pawn shop receipt with his signature, and the photo of Margaret's ring in my palm. I spread them out in front of him like cards in a game he thought he was winning. "Before I sign anything," I said quietly, "maybe you should explain why my ring and my tools ended up for sale. Maybe you should explain the attempted transfer the bank flagged last week. Maybe you should explain why strangers know more about my belongings than I do." The silence that followed was longer than I thought Jason capable of. His face stiffened, his jaw shifted, and he looked at the papers without touching them. Diane appeared in the doorway, tray in her hands, and froze when she saw the spread. For the first time since I had moved into that room, they both looked smaller to me, as if the air had been pulled out of their practiced authority. Jason recovered first, of course. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, trying to summon the intimacy of son to father. "Dad, you don't understand. We did what we had to do. You've been vulnerable, and people take advantage. Not people." I cut in. "My son." That stopped him. Diane set the tray down too quickly, spilling water on the edge of the table. "We only wanted to protect you," she said, her voice tight, her eyes flicking not at me but at Jason, as if asking for the next line of the play. "You wanted to protect my money," I said. "Not me." "Never me," Jason's mask cracked then. He leaned back, the softness gone, the voice no longer careful. "Fine," he said, flat and sharp. "You want the truth? You can't live alone. You'll fall again, and next time no one will find you. You'll starve or rot or forget the stove is on and burn the house down. We're not going to stand by and watch that happen. If it means taking control, then yes, we'll take it. You can hate us for it, but at least you'll be alive." I let the words hang, not because they held any truth, but because they revealed everything. He needed to justify to himself the theft, the betrayal, the reduction of a father to an inconvenience. Diane stood silent, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. They were cornered now, and they knew it. I reached for the envelope I had prepared, heavy with papers from the lawyer, from the bank, from the doctor's visit I had scheduled without telling them. I pushed it across the table toward Jason. "These," I said, "are my statements, my test results, my attorney's contact. They say I am of sound mind, that I am competent, that my accounts are secured and watched. If you try again, it will not be the quiet kind of theft you've practiced so far. It will be a police matter. Do you understand me?" Jason's hand twitched toward the envelope, but he didn't open it. He stared at me with something between rage and disbelief, like a man watching a wall rise where he expected a door. Diane turned away, muttering something about coffee, and left the room. I did not move, not even when Jason finally stood, collected the scattered papers, and said through clenched teeth, "You think you've won something here, but this isn't over, no." I said, looking him in the eye. "It is. Because I know now what you are, and because I am not afraid of you anymore." The moment he left, I locked the door from the inside. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from release. For weeks I had been suffocating under the weight of suspicion, of silence, of half-truths whispered in halls. That morning, it broke. I had spoken, not pleaded. I had confronted, not evaded. And in doing so, I had taken back something they thought was already gone. My will. Later that day, when the house grew quiet again, I packed the essentials into a bag. Margaret's photo, my new phone, the documents, the hidden cash. I left the rest. They had already taken most of what mattered anyway. I called a cab from the landline and waited in the doorway until the headlights appeared. Jason's car was not in the driveway. Diane was upstairs. I walked out into the evening air without a word, without a backward glance, and I closed the chapter of the back room for good. I did not go back to the back room, not that day, and not any day after, because once you have seen yourself reduced to a piece of furniture that the household moves around to clear a path, for its own comfort, you either accept the place they give you, or you stand up, however slowly, and claim a different one. So I rode from their driveway to the attorney's office with the box of papers and Margaret's ring wrapped in a handkerchief, and I signed what needed signing to anchor the ground under my feet, a living trust with a bank fiduciary as successor, a springing power of attorney that activates only upon two independent physicians' determinations and not a son's impatience. A new will that removes Jason and Diane from any bequest and directs what I own toward a small scholarship in Margaret's name for students learning the trades that kept bread on our table for 40 years. And as I initialed each page, I felt a sensation almost physical, as if a tight band around my chest had been cut and I could finally draw a full breath without asking anyone's permission. From there, I went to the police station and filed a report that read dryly when the clerk printed it, but which carried in its thin paragraphs all the weight of what had been done: unauthorized access to my residence, fraudulent attempt at a transfer, the removal and pawning of personal effects including a wedding ring, and I gave them the receipt and the photo and the bank manager's letter, and I listened while an officer explained that family cases often end not with handcuffs, but with boundaries that hold because the paper makes them real. And I said I understood, and that the paper was exactly what I had lacked in the back room, where everything was spoken and nothing was written down, except the parts that would have taken me out of myself. I rented a small apartment in a low brick building that faces east toward a strip of stubborn pines and a cracked basketball court where boys play until the light fails, and the first night there I slept like a man who has walked out of a fever. Not because the bed was better than theirs or the air was sweeter, but because the door had a lock that clicked under my hand, and the kitchen had no schedule, only a kettle and mugs and a jar of coffee so strong it could wake the dead. And I stood in the middle of that quiet space at 5 in the morning and spoke aloud to Margaret without embarrassment, telling her that the ring was home and that I had been slow to act but not too late. And when the sun finally lifted enough to find the window, Eve opened the box of photos and laid 3 on the table. One of us on our 25th anniversary, one of Jason at 12 with his fish and that boundless grin, and one from some ordinary Saturday when the house was crowded with people and no one was measuring my worth by how silent I could be. Over the next week I unwound everything that had been wound around me. I called the company whose cheerful postcard had announced an estate sale at a house where the estate still lived and told them to cancel. I changed the locks and left a note for the neighbors with my new number in case a white SUV appeared with a clipboard and a story. I bought back 2 items that had slipped into other hands: an old radio from a man who polished its knobs as if they held a station from his childhood, and a battered tape measure that a carpenter returned to me with a nod once he heard the whole of it. And I donated the rest of my tools to the vocational high school down the road, where a teacher with sawdust in his hair promised to put them in palms that would respect their weight. Jason called 3 times from numbers that did not identify themselves, and each time I let the phone ring until the machine picked up, and then deleted the message before the accusation could seep into the room. Because there is a particular poison in the kind of sorrow that insists it is love while it empties your drawers, and I had decided that the only antidote was distance measured not just in blocks but in rules. So I sent 1 letter through my attorney that said plainly that any communication would pass through counsel, that any visit would require notice, that any attempt to access my accounts or dwelling would be treated as trespass, and after that the silence felt like rain after a long heat, not a punishment but a change. In Weather That You Learn to Live Inside, Savannah wrote an email, tentative and careful, saying she was sorry for the misunderstanding and asking if I might come to her school play in the spring, and I stared at the screen for a long time, because it is not a child's fault when the adults teach her the wrong language for harm, and I answered that I wished her well, that my door was open to her when she wished to visit on her own terms, and that I would love to see any recording she cared to send. And when no reply came, I did not press, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood the difference between pursuing a connection and begging for one. On Sundays, I began to walk to the community center, where the church ladies serve coffee that could strip paint, and the men in caps trade stories of engines and knees, and I volunteered to help in the wood shop, where the benches are scarred and the visors squeal, and the boys who had never known a patient adult learned how to square a board and how to listen for the note. A plane sings when the blade meets the grain just right, and when they asked me where I learned, I told them that a house will teach you everything if you live in it long enough, and that a good tool used well is a kind of prayer. And I found that the hours there filled the space where dread had lived, not because they erased the betrayal, but because they made it smaller than the tasks at hand. At night I wrote 3 letters by hand, one to the bank manager who had treated me like a person when I felt like evidence, one to the young man at the pawn shop who did the right thing without a promise of return, and one to Margaret, slipped into the back of her photo frame, in which I said that I forgave myself for not seeing sooner, and that I forgave our son for being a man shaped by a hunger I could not fill, which is not the same as forgetting, and not at all the same as trusting, but is the only way I know to keep the past from claiming the chair beside me. There are still mornings when I wake with the old ache and reach for the bell that is no longer there, as if the body remembers servitude even after the mind has thrown it off. And on those mornings I make an extra cup of coffee and sit by the window until the feeling passes, and I remind myself that resting is not a command someone else gives you, but a choice you make when you have earned it, and that I will rest where the window faces east and the door opens from the inside, with a key that lives in my own pocket, and when I pass the mirror I make myself look, not to inventory the lines time has carved, but to recognize the man who stepped out of a story he did not write. They told me, with their careful voices and their tired smiles, to just rest in the back room, and when I found my belongings at their pawn shop, I understood that they had already set the price of my dignity, and that the only person who could raise it was me, so I paid with the currency I had left, stubbornness, signatures, and the refusal to disappear. And now, when the knock comes at my door, it is a neighbor with a jar of jam, a boy with a crooked picture frame to fix, or no one at all, just the wind testing the latch and finding it sure.